Shalom everyone, and thank you for joining me in the study of the Parashat Toldot, the Parasha of this week. In Parashat Toldot, there is one of the most enigmatic stories, which is, how can we explain this special relationship between Yitzchak and Esau, who is described by our sages as someone very wicked, very evil, even deceiving. How can we explain that really Yitzchak wanted to give the blessings, the future, the destiny of Am Israel, of the people of Israel, to someone like that? Couldn't he see that Yaakov should be the chosen one? What can we learn from the introduction to the story of the blessings? So take a look at the narrative. Vayiki zaken Yitzchak, and when Yitzchak grew older, vatichena einav mereot, and his ability to see was compromised. Vayikra et Esav bno hagadol, and he called Esav, his oldest son. Vayomer elav bni, and he says to him, my son. Vayomer elav hineni, and Esav says to Yitzchak, here I am. Which obviously, the first association that comes to mind is Avraham, Vayomer hineni, and he says, here I am. Esav definitely has tremendous respect to his father, and his father calls him. He doesn't say for what yet. But when you look at this pasuk, at this verse, there is something which seems to be superfluous. It says that Yitzchak grew older, so that I understand, because when Yitzchak became older, he wanted to pass on the blessings to his successor. However, why do we need the detail about the fact that he almost became blind? Vatichena einav mereot. His ability to see was compromised, and it was very difficult for him to see. Why is that detail needed? So, the Rashbam says, Vatichena einav, and his eyes were dimmed, or he had difficulties to see, min hazikna, because he just became old. כמו שמצינו בספר שמואל, ועיניו החלו כאות. So the Rashbam says, you know what, don't look too much into it. It's not that deep. It's just pretty simple. People become old, and therefore their ability to see is compromised, and that's exactly what happened to Yitzchak. So in a way, the Rashbam reads the verse, Vayiki zaken Yitzchak, Yitzchak became old, and therefore his eyes were dimmed. However, the problem with this simple understanding of the pasuk is that I would assume that when Yitzchak grew older, it was also difficult for him maybe to walk, or maybe to talk, or maybe to listen, or maybe to verbalize sentences. There are many different things that can come with old age like Yitzchak. So why is it that the Torah emphasized and focused and really zoomed in into Yitzchak's disability to see? So the Rashbam, I guess, was not bothered by that so much. And he says, don't make such a big deal out of it. Yitzchak grew older, therefore his eyes were dimmed, and that's it. However, we will see that most commentators really did not agree with the Rashbam. Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam still says, Vayiki zaken Yitzchak, pshuto shel mikra, he says the simple understanding of the narrative, very much like the Rashbam, shu inyan tiv'i, it's a natural thing. People grow older, their eyes are compromised. ולפיכך הקדים להזכיר סיבתה של חולשת ראייתו, או כליונה, במאמרו, כי זקן יצחק. ואמר ביעקב עליו השלום, ועיני ישראל כבדו מזוקן. So, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam agree with the Rashbam that this is the simple understanding of the narrative, which now, after so many weeks of learning Parsha and learning commentators, we already can hear and sense that there is what we called pshuto shel mikra, the simple basic understanding of the narrative, which is just very much focused on the narrative itself and not midrashim, and not our sages' discussion about it. However, we already hear that there is pshuto shel mikra, there is the simple understanding of the narrative, but at the same time we already hear that there is probably something else that can fit into this narrative. What is this something else? We will see with the next commentator. But then Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam continues on and says, "Ve'adon haneviim alav hashalom," But Moses, נבדל משאר הנביאים בסילוק המקרים הטבעיים אפילו לעת זקנה. Moshe Rabbeinu was really an enigma. He was very different than any other person, because we know that at the end of Sefer Dvarim, of the book of Deuteronomy, when the Torah describes Moshe's physical being, it says, even though he was 120 years and that was his last day on earth, lo nas lecho velo chahata eino. Moshe's eyes didn't dim. He didn't grow old in terms of his physical abilities. But he was really special. He was unique, unlike any other person. Therefore, it was told to us, it was shared with us, that Moshe, unlike any other older person, his physical abilities, capabilities, appearance did not change. So basically, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam says, look, the Torah's opening statement was Yitzchak was old, and therefore his eyes were dimmed, his ability to see was compromised, and that's it. However, the Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam says, I do believe that there might be yet another explanation for why was that so important for the Torah to tell us about Yitzchak's lack of ability to see. The Gemara, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Baba Kama, page 93, Tzadik Gimel, brings a statement from Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says the following: Le'olam al tehi kelalat ediot kala beinecha. He says, never, ever dismiss a curse or something derogative, even from someone who is not that important. Why? She'arei Abimelech kiלל את שרה ונתקיים בזרעה. שנאמר, הנהו לך כסות עיניים. אמר לה, הואיל וכיסית ממני ולא גילית שהוא אישך וגרמת לי הצער הזה, יהי רצון שיהיו לך בנים כסויי עיניים ונתקיים בזרעה. This is an incredible statement, but I need to give a little bit of an introduction. We need to go back to the story of Avram and Sarah when they went down to Plishtim. They went down to the south. And then Abimelech, who was the king of Plishtim, very much like Pharaoh, took Sarah from Abraham. And Sarah and Abraham basically claimed that Sarah is not his wife, but rather his sister. Same episode like Pharaoh in Egypt, same thing with Abimelech. And then God revealed himself to Abimelech, and he says to Abimelech, do not touch her. You need to let her go back to her husband. And Abimelech says to Hashem, oh, I did not know that she is his wife. She even told me that she is his sister. And God says to him, I understand, but give her back. And then Abraham would pray for you. So Abimelech did, but he was very upset. He was very upset with Avram and Sarah, and he told Sarah, ksut einayim. He gave her some gifts, but he says, ksut einayim. What is ksut? Ksut is from the Hebrew word lechasot, which means to cover, to hide. What is einayim? Eyes. So here you have a gift that will be, in a way, says Abimelech, and cursing Sarah, that one of your descendants will be a ksui einayim, which means he will not be able to see. His eyes will be covered. He will not be able to really have a clear vision. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, v'nitkayem bezar'ah. And it was fulfilled with Sarah's descendant. Who is he? Vayi ki zaken Yitzchak, vatichena einav mereot. When Yitzchak became old, he had some kind of a cover on his eyes. He couldn't see. Now, let's pause here. So first and foremost, we see that Rabbi Yitzchak did not attribute the difficulty that Yitzchak had with his eyes just to an old age. Not at all. he tracked it to where? To the time that Abimelech cursed Sarah because he felt deceived. And he says, because you deceived me, Abimelech says to Sarah, and because of that I suffered, because God basically bestowed some kind of a plague over Abimelech and his family members. So Abimelech says to her, because of you, you deceived me. You in a way covered my eyes by saying that you are Abraham's sister. Therefore, I'm giving you something, and I in a way wish that what? That your descendants will suffer from the same thing, and it was fulfilled. Yitzchak had difficulties in seeing. Now, if that's true, we have something very interesting. Abimelech felt deceived. He felt that Sarah and Abraham in a way covered his eyes so he couldn't see that Sarah is Abraham's wife. And because of that he suffered. If we take this concept and we basically copy-paste to what's going on with Yitzchak and Esau, we already can envision perhaps a different take to the story. It seems to be that Yitzchak's eyes were covered because of what his mom, Sarah, did with Abimelech. And now Yitzchak is going to basically get into some complicated issue. When he cannot see the truth, when his eyes are covered, his ability to see is compromised, and he's going to what? To be deceived by his son. Almost identical to Abimelech and Sarah, but from the other end. Yitzchak's eyes are covered. He can't really see Esau for what he was. And then Yaakov will need to deceive Yitzchak in order to receive the blessing. And all of it is because of what? Because Sarah and Abraham deceived Abimelech by telling him that Sarah is Abraham's sister. So this is obviously not because of old age, but this is in a way some kind of a vicious cycle that had to be end with Yitzchak. Yitzchak had to be deceived, his eyes had to be covered because of what Sarah did, and in a way it brought upon this animosity between Esau and Yaakov, not only at that time, but for generations to come. The Talmud in Megillah, in Tractate Megillah, page 28, brings another statement by Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, "Vayi ki zaken Yitzchak vatichena einav merot." What is the meaning of that pasuk that Yitzchak became old and therefore his eyes were dimmed? Mishum de istakel be'esav harasha. Because he looked at Esau's face, and Esau was evil, and according to Rabbi Elazar, everyone who looked at an evil person, his eyes dimmed or become difficult for him to see now on. Now, before I'll try to explain Rabbi Elazar, we do see that this idea or this detail that Yitzchak's eyes were dimmed or he had difficulties to see bothered everyone. Rashbam, in the beginning of the 12th century, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Arambam later on in the 13th century, and obviously before with Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Elazar in the 3rd and 4th century, already before obviously the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Avraham ben Arambam, they all spoke about it because, again, as I said really at the beginning of the shiur, it seems to be so superfluous. The fact that Yitzchak grew old, we understand, so now it's about time to give blessings, but why do I need to know if his eyes were dimmed or if he was able to see? How does that contribute to the story? And now we understand. According to Rabbi Yitzchak, it was because of Abimelech. And according to Rabbi Elazar, it's because of Yitzchak's lack of judgment. Yitzchak, according to Rabbi Elazar, was probably so naive, or maybe he was very optimistic. He looked at Esau and he thought, he can be my successor. It might be because opposites attract, and Yitzchak was very inactive or more passive, and Esau is a hunter, so he's a very active person. It might be that Yitzchak couldn't bear the fact or the idea of rejecting one son and keeping only one son, unlike Abraham, who had to expel Ishmael and keep Yitzchak. Maybe he had this trauma. Maybe after the Akedah, he just believed that everyone can be good, but Rabbi Lazar says Yitzchak had to see that Esau is an evil person, a wicked person. And when Yitzchak continued to look at him, he basically lost his ability to see. So it was a punishment. It was a punishment for Yitzchak's lack of judgment and lack of understanding of who Esau is. So that's Rabbi Elazar. The Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah says the following. That's going to be one of the harshest and most difficult midrashim to understand. Vayiki zaken Yitzchak, and when Yitzchak became old and his eyes were dimmed, Rabbi Yitzchak patach. So Rabbi Yitzchak made his opening statement for this midrash by quoting a verse from Isaiah, from Yeshaya. Matzdikei rasha ekev shochad. What does it mean? People who justify evil people because they take bribery, because they take bribe. כל מי שנוטל שוחד ומצדיק את הרשע בעקב, וצדקת צדיקים יסירו ממנו, וצדקת הצדיקים זה משה, יסירו ממנו זה יצחק, על ידי שהצדיק את הרשע כהוא עיניו, ויהי כי זקן יצחק. This is even difficult to say. Basically, Rabbi Yitzchak blames Yitzchak, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, Rabbi Isaac, blames Yitzchak, our father, in taking bribe. And that was the reason for him not to see the deficiencies and the faults and the evil doings of Esau, of his son. What kind of bribe are we talking about? So it might be that it was what? Like when the narrative described that Esau was a hunter, and it says, Vayehav Yitzchak et Esau, and Yitzchak loved Esau. Why? Ki tzayid befiv. He would bring the food home. He would probably or maybe sustain the family or help sustain the family. Yitzchak, in a way, according to Rabbi Yitzchak in the Midrash, basically says that Yitzchak was not able to see Esau's deficiencies, and not only that he was not able to see his deficiencies, he justified everything that went wrong, and because of that, his eyes were punished and he was not able to see. And we can also understand, if you cannot see in terms of judgment, if you cannot see Esau's wrongdoings and you still continue to justify it, in a way Yitzchak lost his ability to physically to see. But this is a very harsh midrash, basically blaming Yitzchak of doing something that we will disqualify a judge for that, to take bribe? Yes. How come? How can we explain something like that? So, let's wait for that question, and let's see another midrash. Vatichena einav merot. As we said before, Yitzchak's eyes were dimmed. Amar Rab Lazar ben Azariah, mereot bera. Mereot bera'ato shel rasha. This midrash is exactly the opposite from the midrash that we mentioned before. And this is the beauty of our sages' wisdom. If the first midrash we spoke about, the last one we spoke about, was blaming Yitzchak in a very harsh accusation that he took bribe and therefore he was punished, this midrash justifies Yitzchak. And not only justifies Yitzchak, explain why was he almost blind, because of what? Because Hashem says, Yeh Yitzchak yotze lashuk v'yun briyat ha'amrin dein avua de'or reshia. Esau was a terrible person. and he did terrible things. And Hashem was concerned that if Yitzchak will go to the marketplace, he will go to the street, people will point their finger on Yitzchak, and they will say, oh my gosh, this is the father of this evil guy, this is a disgrace, or as they say, this is a shanda, this is terrible. And therefore Hashem says, so what should I do in order to protect my beloved Yitzchak? So, אלא הריני מחאה את עיניו והוא יושב בתוך ביתו. הדה הוא דכתיב בקום רשעים יסתר אדם. So Hashem said, you know what? I need to help Yitzchak not to be exposed to what his son doing and not to ruin his reputation. So I'm going to make him blind, and therefore he will need to stay home. And if he stay home, no one will bother him. No one will say anything to embarrass him. So, it seems to be here that Yitzchak's blindness was not a punishment. It was not to fulfill Abimelech's curse, but exactly the opposite. It's a protection. Hashem wanted to protect Yitzchak from being embarrassed in public, and therefore he made him blind, so he will stay home, and no one will make the connection between him and Esau. And then they say, Mikan Amru, from here you learn, Kol ha'ma'amid ben rasha o talmid rasha, if you have an evil child or an evil student, sof she'einav kehot. So at the end, your eyes will dim or you will almost go blind, so you will not be embarrassed by your child, your evil child or your evil student. This midrash is fascinating. Because here it's not a punishment. It basically says, Yitzchak didn't reprimand Esau. Maybe he couldn't, maybe he didn't know. But Hashem in a way felt that he needs to protect Yitzchak from being embarrassed. And therefore, he, in a way, gave him something that looks like punishment. He became blind. But was only to protect Yitzchak. So now we have different variations of reasons. Rashbam, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Arambam, they spoke about the pshat hakatuv, the simple understanding of the narrative that basically creates the link between old age and blindness or difficulty to see. Then we saw that it was a punishment for what Sarah and Avraham did to Abimelech. They deceived him and therefore they covered his eyes. His descendant was also, his eyes was covered and he was deceived. Later on, Yitzchak is being blamed, accused of taking bribe. And that was a punishment for taking bribe. And this one says exactly the opposite. God loves Yitzchak and he wants to protect him. And this is the reason why his eyes were dimmed. In Midrash Tanchuma, elaborates a bit and maybe even focused on the fact of the bribe. Take a look. ולמה קהו עיניו של יצחק? Simple question. What's the reason that Yitzchak's eyes almost became blind? So the Midrash says, על שהיה מביא ציד ומאכילו וכתיב כי השוחד יעבר פיקחים. Esau basically bribed Yitzchak by bringing food. Now, it might be that it's not the bribe we are talking about in terms of here is an envelope, little envelope, and here you take, or you do this for me and I'll do that for you. Maybe it's not quote unquote the modern bribe, but it might be that the accusation to Yitzchak was the following. Yitzchak became dependent on Esau. Esau in a way took charge on feeding his father. And by seeing Esau every day, and by eating from what he brought, and the appreciation that probably Yitzchak had towards Esau by going every day, risking himself to try to bring food, that created some kind of connection between Yitzchak and Esau, that Yitzchak couldn't see anything wrong with Esau, and even if he could, it was vague, it was cloudy, because he was so dependent on Esau that he couldn't see the truth in front of his eyes. Rashi again now from the 11th century in France, he found a different reason. Why Yitzchak's eyes were dimmed. Vatichena be'ashanan shel elu. What does it mean with the smoke of these people? Who are those people? What smoke Rashi is talking about? So in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 26, it says, ויהי עשיו בן 40 שנה, עשיו, when was he 40 years old, ויקח אישה את יהודית בת בארי החיתי, he took a woman by the name of Yehudit, the daughter of בארי החיתי, the Hittites, ואת בסמת בת אילון החיתי, ותהיינה מורת רוח ליצחק ולרבקה. And they were a terrible, like a thorn in their eyes, in the eyes of Yitzchak and Rivka, which means Esau got married with two women, and both of them were not good women, and they were definitely didn't bring any nachat, and they didn't bring any satisfaction or love to Yitzchak and Rivka. So what does that have anything to do with smoke? So says the Gur Aryeh, which is the Maharal, he explains Rashi, and he says the following. פירוש היו מקטירים לעבודה זרה. Esau got married with two women that were idol worshippers. So just imagine. Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, the person who created this movement of monotheism and believing in one God and not believing in any idols, his son, Yitzchak's son, which means Abraham's grandson, gets married with two women who are fully dedicated idol worshippers, and they are worshipping their idols in the same tent, in the same campus where Yitzchak and Rivka live, and that smoke that comes to their idols, that's what basically caused Yitzchak to be blind. כי מפני שהיה ליצחק קדושה, לא קדושה כמו שאר קדושה, רק קדושה יתרה. Yitzchak was highly sensitive to it. Because obviously the question is, if their smoke caused blindness, how come that Rivka did not become blind? How come that Yaakov did not become blind? So the Gur Aryeh says Yitzchak was blind because he was highly sensitive. He had this special, unique sanctity, holiness. Because of what? שהיה קורבן קדוש להשם שנקרב על המזבח. Because don't forget, he was one who was brought on the altar when Abraham was told by Hashem to take his son and to bring him as a sacrifice. So his level of kedusha, his level of sanctity and holiness was the highest. ומפני גודל הקדושה שהוא קורבן להשם, לכך קראו עיניו. And because he was so holy, his eyes were dimmed as a result of that smoke that was brought to the idols. מפני כי הראייה היא יותר קדושה בעבור שהראות עניין שכלי. לכך לא היה אפשר להתחבר ראות יצחק הקדוש עם תינופת עבודה זרה. So now he explains something which is very deep. He says, the ability to see is not only just that I can see you. When I say I see, it means also I understand. I internalize it, I recognize it. Cognitively, I also can see it. And therefore, Yitzchak couldn't see idols and at the same time to be connected spiritually. So what did Hashem do? He cut the ability to see. So Yitzchak basically now focused only on the spiritual realm, meaning no reflection of physical ability to see, but only to have the ability to see cognitively or prophetically. ואלו דברים הם דברי חוכמה, ידועים לחכמים שראוי ליצחק ראיות העין בכוח קדושה. Meaning he was able to see with his holiness. וכאשר היה שם תינופת קראו עיניו. So the minute that there is impurity, the minute that there is something that it's against spirituality, Yitzchak couldn't see. So, this commentary basically gives yet another reason for Yitzchak's blindness, which is, from the get-go, Yitzchak had to reprimand Esau and to tell him, what are you doing? Those two women do not fit here. They should believe in monotheism and drop their paganism, or just don't marry them. But Yitzchak didn't. Yitzchak didn't say a thing to Esau. didn't talk to him, didn't chastise him, didn't rebuke him. The only time that there is some kind of a conversation is that when Yitzchak is about to die and he tells Esau, okay, bring me some food and I'll give you some blessings. When these two women came into Yitzchak's campus and they start worshipping their idols, that's when Yitzchak was not able to see anymore. According to the Maharal and Rashi, it seems to be that it was not necessarily a punishment, but it was some kind of a natural outcome. Because Yitzchak was so holy, because Yitzchak was so connected to spiritual worlds and universes, his ability to see was not just like my ability to see or your ability to see. He was able to see much deeper. And when this ability confronted the smoke of paganism and idol worshipping, it ended. And he couldn't see physically, he could only see spiritually. So that's according to the Maharal. Then Rashi brings another reason. דבר אחר, a different explanation. כשנעקד על גבי המזבח והיה אביו רוצה לשוחטו, when Yitzchak basically was brought as a sacrifice and Avraham basically bound Yitzchak, Isaac, on the altar, באותה שעה נפתחו השמיים. This is a very interesting midrash. When, just imagine that Avraham brings his son, puts him on the altar, he's about to take the knife to slaughter Yitzchak, and then the heavens open up. וראו מלאכי השרת והיו בוכים. The ministering angels start crying. They will start crying because if Yitzchak is going to be killed, if Yitzchak is going to be slaughtered, that's the end of Avraham's family. And they will start crying. וירדו דמעותיהם ונפלו על עיניו. And their tears dropped into Yitzchak's eyes. לפיכך קהו עיניו. And this is why his eyes were dimmed or were compromised. Which means because they cried and their tears fell into his eyes, so later on in his life, he became blind. But let's just pause here for a second. What does that mean? If you tell me that because of the angel's tears, he became blind, how come that it was basically delayed until he became old? It should have been the minute after he went down from the Moriah mountain, after he finished with the Akedah, he should be blind. It might be that the answer for that is that what the Midrash is trying to describe is that connection, that point of connection between humans and angels. When Yitzchak was put on the altar, he basically was already elevated to be a mini angel. He already went to these angelic spheres, and the ministering angels were crying. Those are the same ministering angels that at the beginning of creation didn't think that to create a human being is a good thing. And now they see how much a human being can contribute to bring spirituality and to reveal God in this universe. And they are crying. At that moment, their tears came into Yitzchak's eyes, but it was delayed until he became old, and that was his moment to pass along the blessings that will allow the son, really, which will be Yaakov, to carry on that legacy, to carry on the legacy that people can act like angels, that people can show dedication to God. That had to wait until Yitzchak was ready in his old age to pass on the blessings. So that's the other explanation of Rashi. And then Rashi says one more thing. דבר אחר, another explanation. כדי שייטול יעקב את הברכות. Now, this is a fascinating suggestion. Rashi says, you know why was he blind? So Yaakov can take the blessings. Without Yitzchak being blind, Yaakov will not be able to get the blessings. Esau will take them. So obviously you can ask a question. But you know what? Maybe if he would be able to see, he would know that what? That Esau is wicked. He will reject him, and then he will take Yaakov. Answer, he will not. He probably would not. And why? Many, many reasons. I will share with you one. As I said before, Yitzchak did not say that only Esau will be his successor. Yitzchak might think that, you know what, maybe we'll have co-chairs, okay, co-leaders, Esau and Yaakov. Yaakov is an Ish Tam Yoshev Alim, he's a Torah scholar, wonderful. But Esau is the active guy, he's the warrior, he's the hunter, he's the one who is going to lead my movement, my father's movement, my mother's movement, this monotheist movement, the movement of kindness and compassion and justice. He is going to show how can you do it day in, day out there in the field. Yaakov sits in a tent, so it's easier for him to be nice, to be kind, to be compassionate. But Esau, he is the example. Therefore, Hashem had to take his ability to see, so Yaakov can deceive him. But now you ask a question. So Yaakov had to deceive his own father in order to get the blessings, and look what was the outcome. Terrible hate. Esau wanted to kill Yaakov. Yaakov had to flee. Then they come back, and for generations we have this confrontation with Esau and his descendants. So was that worth it? So I'm not sure if it's worth it or not. I can say only one thing. Yaakov had to go through this deception in order to prove himself worthy of the blessings. There is a point in Yitzchak's calculation. If Yaakov is just a Torah scholar, sits in a tent and is not involved and not immersed in the day-to-day life, it's a waste to give him all those blessings. The destiny of the Jewish people is not to seclude themselves and not to be involved and immersed in the day-to-day life and in the world and innovation and science and medicine and all the rest of all the other things in the world. Obviously, we have a goal to learn Torah and to spread Torah and God's values. But at the same time, we need to do it through involvement in this world. And therefore, Yaakov had to go through some kind of a transformation, a personality transformation, from just being someone who sits in a tent to someone who can go into his father's tent and say, I am your first son, and to take the blessings, and then to go through tribulations and afflictions and challenges, and to prove himself worthy of someone who can lead the Jewish people, knowing that his anchor is the Torah, but also his mission is to be involved in the world around him and to elevate all of them spiritually. The Bechor Shor continues this idea by saying, ותיכנה עיניו מרות, and you know why Yitzchak's eyes were dimmed, שלא תטמע איך נתחלף לו יעקב בעשיו. So you should not wonder how come he doesn't know that Yaakov and Esau switched, which really Yaakov switched Esau. He couldn't see. So this is why. So again, he agreed with the last interpretation in Rashi that basically says it was all in order to prepare it for Yaakov to take the blessings. The Sforno, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno from the 16th century in Italy, he adds yet another layer. He says, ותיכנה עיניו כמו שקרא לעלי שלא מיכה בבניו, כי אומרו ולא כיהה בהם ונאמר בו, ועיניו כמה לא יכלו לראות, ולא קרא זה לאברהם ויעקב שהיו יותר זקנים ממה שהיה יצחק אז וממה שהיה עלי. Basically he says, you know why Yitzchak's eyes were compromised? Because he did not rebuke Esau. Happened the same thing to Eli, the priest. He did not chastise his children, and therefore he was not able to see. Basically, Sforno says, if you cannot see the deficiencies of your children, your students, the people around you, and you don't say anything, you become apathetic to it, you become blind to it. So in a way, God took his ability to see. This is an educational error on Yitzchak's end, which the Sforno basically emphasized. And he says Yitzchak was unable, educationally, to correct Esau, and therefore Esau lost it. In a way, the blame is being shifted from Esau to Yitzchak. The one who was able to see and to see very clearly was Sarah. Back then, in Parashat Vayera, it says, ותרא שרה את בן הגר המצרית אשר ילדה לאברהם מצחק, ותרא, and she saw that Ishmael, but his behavior is not conducive for Yitzchak's upbringing. ותאמר לאברהם, גרש את האמה הזאת ואת בנה, כי לא יירש בין האמה הזאת עם בני עם יצחק. And she demanded Abraham, expel Hagar, expel her son. He is not going to be around my son. That was Sarah. Sarah was able to see in one of the most crucial moments of Jewish history, of Abrahamic history. She demanded that Yitzchak will be raised by himself. That was a tough decision. Abraham didn't want to hear about it until God intervened. But Sarah had the ability to see from few different little things. She understood that Ishmael cannot be with Yitzchak. But Yitzchak failed to see that. So as we conclude, we saw different reasons for something that looks very, very much superfluous, not needed in the narrative. The fact that Yitzchak's eyes were dimmed, or he became almost blind, or his ability to see was compromised. And each one of the commentator or the sages tried to explain why, and they tried to give us a variety of reasons, that with each one of them we can elaborate on it on more and more, and to try to understand this very enigmatic story of stealing of the blessings. But there is one lesson that I think is the common denominator for all the explanations, which is the ability to see is not only just a physical ability. God's expectation from us is to see much deeper, to elevate our eyes, to see the horizon, to see something beneath just a superficial understanding, to try to dig in to a subject, to try to really grasp the idea, and then to make the right decisions. Thank you.